Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the January 18th Orange County Sewer District #1 Advisory Committee. Please note that this meeting is being transmitted via live stream. For those looking to live stream, please go to orangecountygov.com, clicking on the tab for the legislature and locating the meeting down below. Please silence your cell phones, tablets, and other devices, and please keep in mind that the microphones are very sensitive here, so we'll go right into it from there. Roll call, please, Kelly.
Emma?
Here.
Ellie? Here. Jamie?
Here.
Elders? Patel? Joey?
Okay.
President Thompson.
Okay, great. And if you join me for the pledge of allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We had a little bit of a break here. Haven't met since November, but first up, we will have Richard Golden, County Attorney, Joseph Mahoney, Senior Assistant County Attorney. I don't see Eric here, but we have Bob Gray, Deputy Commissioner EF&S, Anthony Griffin, Principal Sanitary Engineer, and Mary Beth Bianconi, Partner of Delaware Engineer. Don't break your back.
I was gonna say, weightlifting. Everyone has to read this. Okay then. Or not.
Cliff notes.
Yes. You have clicked.
Nice executive session.
How did you know?
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
What is this?
I'd like to recognize Monroe Town Supervisor Tony Cardone. Thank you for coming. Gally Riggin from Palm Tree, and Isaac and Joel. Yes, we're back there from the Village of South Williamsburg. Okay, first up, we have item A, the final facility plan update and final environmental impact study update. So going to that, I know last time we met, kind of coming down towards the some progress here.
You guys want to start or you want me to start? All right, so on all of that, we are at the wire, as you mentioned. We've talked for a long time about how there's a relationship between the facility plan, the EIS, and the variance. So we've been kind of working at all of those things coming together. In terms of the facility plan, we have comments that we received from EF&S that we are about 99% finished with. We are going to send back a draft comment response letter to the staff with some questions, but with a lot of answers as well. So that's going to kind of wrap that up. Nothing in the comments is going to change any of the fundamental recommendations or any of those kinds of things that we reviewed here back in, I believe it was August, when we were all together. So that's really kind of cleaning up some technical details and those kinds of things. The EIS is in exactly the same spot because now that we have the facility plan in that position, we can now pull the information out of the facility plan and into the EIS. So those are both in the 90% complete range. What we do have today is all of this lovely material, my giant books, are the variants. So folks will recall that we have requested a variance from water quality standards for total dissolved solids and chloride through the Department of Environmental Conservation. This is regarding our species permit that was issued on March 1st of 2020. And people will recall that we submitted a variance application in early 2021. We received a notice of incomplete application, and that we knew we were going to get that notice of incomplete application because there aren't really a lot of variances out there in the world. There's really only one for mercury. And we knew that the DEC would need to provide us with some guidance in terms of the documentation that they wanted to see to process the variance. So the notice of incomplete application provided us with that guidance. And then folks will remember, we spent a lot of time working on something called a quality assurance project plan, which is the plan under which water quality sampling was undertaken this past September. And data was returned for that, and that's been analyzed. And that is actually what this enormous book is. This is, so this is called Total Dissolved Solid and Chloride Sampling Project Results Report. So this is the report that was prepared by Tracy, who you all recall is our environmental scientist in our office, one of our environmental scientists. This includes the quality assurance plan. It includes her certification regarding the sampling being conducted in accordance with that plan. It also includes a summary of the results, and it includes all of the lab results, which is why it's so fat. Because we took somewhere, I think, Anthony, in the neighborhood of 350-ish individual water samples. So when I jokingly said to Legislator Benelli, you have to read this, of course you don't. In fact, I have read the summary. I have not read all of the data because it's not my job. There's other people whose job it is to read all the data. All of this data has been transmitted to your technical staff here. That was done by email because it's a much more condensed way to do it than give everyone a giant book. But essentially the summary is, I think, really important to go over. And then this other document is the actual, this is actually missing about 15 sheets of paper that we just didn't get finished last night, but that I believe is being done today, which is a summary of technical issues, but this is the actual response to the notice of incomplete application. So what's happened with this is this again has gone to staff for their review. So obviously nothing will happen with it until everyone's reviewed it and it's gotten approved. But this is fundamentally the information that DEC requested from us. So to the question of is there a Reader's Digest version, this is the Reader's Digest version. As you know, I'm kind of good about making sure that we have the Reader's Digest version. Let's see. I made 15, I don't know. Wait, here's some. Let me grab at least one more. What's on that? Do we have, oh, there we go. We haven't had enough. All right, super. So what this document does is it does provide you with a brief summary of what's in these giant books. The top is simply a discussion of the application. What was the application for? It was an application for variance from water quality based effluent limits for total dissolved solids and chloride in accordance with of the New York Code of Regulations, section 70217. Then you will remember that when we applied for this variance, we applied for it due to a certain number of infeasible aspects of the project. One was that it's a naturally occurring pollutant concentration that prevents attainment of the water quality standard. 2 is that it's a human-caused condition. And 3 is that the controls that would have to be in place would result in what's called substantial and widespread economic and social impact. So without going back through the whole entire variance, which you all may remember, what this couple pages does is it tells you what's the change. What did we do in response to DEC's requests? So a substantial part of that is the water quality sampling. And I think this is not long, so I'll just kind of get through it so we can all understand what we were doing. Water quality sampling conducted in September of 2020 found that concentrations of chloride could be in excess of half of the 250 milligrams per liter effluent limit. And that was present in the raw water supply as well as upstream in the Ramapo River. And then there is an attachment here, which I do want to point out to people. I'm going to just interrupt myself for 2 seconds and kind of go over that. But this is important to understand. So this attachment, which is actually matches my sweater, did not plan this, shows where the water quality sampling was conducted. It also shows the extent of of the Orange County Sewer District #1 service area, which is in the sort of pea green color. And then some of the satellite communities, which in this map, just to get the scale correct, are these sort of yellow colors that are close to the color of my sweater. But it's showing the location of sampling locations. And it's also providing some of the sampling results, just without going into the giant book. What this sampling was for was total dissolved solids and chlorides. Some of the labels might not make a lot of sense. They're things like RRTTS6, but they're tracked through the document. But we did take a number of samples. This is not by no means all of them, but this just show sort of the what's going on with TDS and chloride in the watershed here. So we have some TDS and chloride samples that are very, very high. TDS of 6,600 and 3,800 up at the poultry plant. That's effluent going into the wastewater treatment plant. At the wastewater treatment plant in the village of Curious Joel, TDS of 2,800 and 1,200 chlorides. As we get now further downstream, we're still seeing very high, these are stream sampling locations. We're still seeing very high TDS, 1,600 and chloride at 820. Starting to get a little more diluted in the next sample as we work our way down, 340 for TDS and 120 for chloride. We get down closer to the Harriman wastewater treatment plant. We've bumped up a bit and we're seeing 530 for TDS and 280 for chloride. At the treatment plant, effluent is 480 for total dissolved solids and 220 for chloride. Again, in the stream, 610 for total dissolved solids and 240 for chloride. And then as we get down closer to outfall 002, which is the furthest south outfall for the Harriman wastewater treatment plant, we're at a total dissolved solid of 350 and 220 for chlorides in the water. And just remembering the regulatory standard for total dissolved solid is 500 milligrams per liter. And for chloride, it's 250 milligrams per liter, and chloride is a constituent, one of many, of total dissolved solids. I just think the geography is interesting because as you read through the summary of what these results mean, it's important to understand what we found. So what we found was that chloride concentrations are elevated above historical background levels in groundwater and surface water, both of which are used for drinking water in the service area. These increases in chlorides are caused by human action and also contribute to concentrations of TDS in the local geology. Chloride concentrations in surface and groundwater have been increasing in the last few decades due to increasing human population and related urbanization. One of the things that's really important to note here is this is not just a Harriman problem. This is happening broadly, certainly across the Northeast and across the nation. This is not just a here problem. Chloride is one of the constituents of TDS, and concentrations of TDS are increasing over time. Because chloride is one of those components, discussions of TDS and chloride cannot be separated. Elevated chloride concentrations in any location will be measured as elevated TDS, because remember, chloride is a component of total dissolved solids. As a source of chloride in the influent, the Harriman wastewater treatment plant appears to be urban, non-point source. Removal of chloride from Harriman wastewater treatment plant prior to discharge will not result in an improvement in surface or groundwater quality in the Ramsey Basin. And that's really important, again, for supporting the reason for a variance. One of the other major things that the notice of incomplete application asked us to do was evaluate with the local departments of health. What they asked for was the potential increased risk to human health and the environment. So the result of that discussion, and we reached out to both the Orange County Department of Health and the Rockland County Departments of Health, was that no known quantitative data on hydrologic connections between the Ramapo River and public wells were identified. There are wells identified as groundwater under the direct influence of surface water, or what we call GWEDI, in Rockland County. Both Orange and Rockland County Health Departments communicated concerns over watershed-wide chloride concentrations impeding use of groundwater, and believe protection of the Ramapo River is important to protection of those drinking water sources in the alluvial valleys. However, their statements are inconclusive. So alluvial valleys is just our type of geology that we have here. And the reason that this, there are certainly concerns, but it's inconclusive, has to do with really these next couple of paragraphs. Total dissolved solids does not have a drinking water maximum contaminant limit, yet sodium has health advisory levels. Of the total dissolved constituents with an MCL, nitrate and sodium are exceeded in the outfall at 001 at Harriman, while only sodium exceeds the advisory level at 002. And again, remembering where is this coming from? It's coming from the groundwater around us. Ramapo River increases flow between the Harriman wastewater treatment plant and the village of Suffern by between 10 and 15 times. It's 13 miles downstream of outfall 01 and 11.5 miles downstream of outfall 02. Therefore, it is not expected that Harriman wastewater treatment plant effluent is dominant in the river flow in the vicinity of the well fields in Rockland County. It's just too much distance. And there's a lot of, and the report goes on to describe all of the tributaries to the Ramapo that are creating a tremendous pollution factor. Granting of variance, water quality standards for total dissolved chloride and total dissolved solids and chloride will not increase risk to human health and the environment over current conditions, as these are already present in the ground and surface water in the Ramapo River watershed, including upstream of the Harriman wastewater treatment plant, as well as any other wastewater treatment plant. Moreover, the presence of TDS and chloride in the groundwater are higher than usual concentrations throughout the Ramapo watershed and indeed other watersheds in the Northeast United States indicates this is a regional issue, which is certainly what we've been saying for quite some time. We just now have a lot of data to support what we've been contending. So the rest of this is the conclusions of the report, which are saying that comparing what we've learned to the regulatory standards that have been established, we've been able to show that the variance is justified and necessary, as TDS is naturally occurring, non-specific water quality indicator measurement, which in this region is historically reflective of geology. We've also shown that that the requirement to achieve chloride limit is requested as chloride concentrations are a variance from the requirement to achieve chloride limit is requested as chloride concentrations are above historic background in the surface water and groundwater, and increased concentrations are due to widespread human population increases and associated urbanization. This is a watershed and regional environmental concern. Since TDS analysis measures any chloride present in the sample, TDS concentrations have increased along with increases in chloride concentrations due to human activity that may only be reaching the exceedance of the water quality standard because of a combination of naturally occurring hardness, which we all know our groundwater here is hard, and human-induced increases in chloride. So in addition, we had to show that there would be significant additional environmental impact on a wider scale, as well as a disproportionate substantial economic and social impact. And we actually did do in the document, we did quite a bit of financial analysis. The EPA uses a metric based on median household incomes in your service area compared to the cost of treatment. And the impacts, which I didn't put in here, but are certainly in this document, are that they are moderate to large impacts to the residents of the Harriman service area. So we go on to conclude that compliance with the species permit limits for TDS and chloride through additional wastewater treatment will result in substantial economic burden and adverse environmental impact resulting from implementing a technology such as reverse osmosis to remove TDS and chloride from the wastewater effluent. Achievement of these limits, Harriman would not remedy background concentrations of these constituents in the Ramapo River, nor in drinking water supplies in the region. Rather, this is a regional watershed management approach to achieving water quality standards, which is required. And that's what we've been saying all along. So now we have the science to demonstrate and support our position regarding variance. So that's what All's Giant Book says. As we said, it's been sent to staff for review. And we certainly would expect there to be a deep review of this and comments as well. But again, and I think we spoke about this when we were here in October, the results of our sampling, or maybe even the November meeting, certainly sustain the position that we've had from the outset, which is that a combination of urbanization, right? We're a pretty densely built area all around in all of the service area, as well as the geology of this area are working against us in terms of meeting the water quality standard for total dissolved solids and chloride. And as a result, the variance in our estimation is supported, and DEC should be issuing, and we had a discussion with staff about this last Friday, I believe. The way that the DEC will issue this variance will be in a new species permit, whether it's a modification to the permit that we have or the issuance of a new permit, because we're kind of getting, permit was issued in 2020, it's a 5-year permit, it will end in 2025. So since we're in 2023, they have options. They can either issue a modification that would carry for the 6 MGD plant through the end of 2025, or they could issue a new permit that would start a new 5-year timeframe for that permit for the variance. We don't know which they're going to select, but that's what we're in the process of doing right now.
As a modification.
As a modification, correct. That's what they've asked us to propose, so that's what we're doing.
Just quick to know that on the three things, the facility plan, the FEIS, and the variance. Given your professional background, any sense of when this will come to closure? Any of these?
So right now, we owe staff our return comments on the facility plan, which I know folks in my office are working on, have been working on, or we're continuing to work on today. We anticipate getting that to you next week for your review. We've given you this for your review. EIS is not going to be anything new. It's all things that come from these documents. So certainly, what we've tried to do is not, duplicate having to change things over and over again. So we sort of start with a root document, we're working our way. So in our perfect world, we'd like to have these all come together, certainly before our next meeting next month. That's ideal.
That's the responses from. Okay.
So we have our, we provide information to your technical staff, and then your technical staff needs time to review and comment and those kinds of things. So that's.
And I guess the last one, the variance, any sense of what, how long maybe EDC to respond to our request?
That's
From
next.
your history, historical.
Excellent question. Obviously, they're very engaged in this. They're very aware that, that this is, a priority for the county. I know that, staff's had some recent communications with DEC regarding other matters. So I would think that this would get a top priority for the department, but it's very difficult to know. They have limited resources, and I don't know what other things they have in front of them, but they certainly are aware of this. It's not a new application. We're adding data that they requested. So hopefully it would not take them a long time to respond to us.
And in lay terms, what is not a long time for them? I mean, you're using terms I don't know, I'm just asking.
Permitting processes, so if we can kind of think about, this is would be issued as a modification use permit.
Uh-huh.
So right now, your current permit is 20-something odd pages long. Some of what's in that permit, one of the things that's in there is the mercury variance, right? That every wastewater treatment plant across the state has that in it. This will be adding, I would assume, a very similar section to the permit. The way the permit processes go, and I know Anthony has been working with Tracy on this, we need to finish filing the permit application that will go in with this. We submit, believe it or not, a short environmental assessment form. It's a requirement of permit modifications, so we'll submit that. Once DEC has that and they declare the application complete, they put out a draft permit for public review. That public review is a minimum of 30 days. If any, and that's just, it's under the State Administrative Procedures Act. This is a UPA permit, a Uniform Procedures Act permit. So if anyone out there requests additional time, it's not uncommon that the state would grant additional time for review for a permit like this. Once they close their permit process, their public process, their processing is usually relatively quick, 60 days, something like that. So several months. Sure.
Where does public comment period fit in?
So there's gonna be actually a couple of public comment periods, right? So there will be, because the variance application is being treated as a modification to a speedies permit, all speedies permits, believe it or not, have public comment periods. They happen, a lot of us aren't really paying that much attention to them, but they all happen. So there will be a public comment period regarding the variance, the modification of the speedies permit. And again, that will happen when DEC deems the permit complete and they have issued a new draft permit that embodies the variance language. And that is a 30-day period, so presumably out a couple of months, you know, if we can get this application in, let's say next month. And then probably very similar timeline would be the public comment that would be embedded in the environmental impact statement. So once we have our comments back from staff and we embed them in these documents, we put them in the draft environmental impact statement, that will come to this group, and we've kind of been through this timeline before. The legislature is the lead agency for that environmental impact statement, and I believe we've talked in the past about the process being that this group would accept and certainly staff will look at the environmental impact, the DEIS, the draft environmental impact statement. And then I think the path was that this would go to physical services, who would then evaluate it, and then it would be recommended to the full legislature, who at that point in the environmental review process would be accepting the draft environmental impact statement as complete and ready for public review. So it's not an end game decision at that point. It's initiating the public review process, which seeker provides that to the extent that you're going to have that type of process, it has a minimum of 30 days. It is more common that it's 60 days, just because 30 days is pretty quick. With something so complex, there is a publication requirement that the environmental review documents be published online so that people can have access to them. And we'll work with county to make sure that that happens. So that public review process, in a perfect world, we do them kind of at the same time, so that we don't put a burden on the public to try to figure out, oh, I need to comment on this one now and then that one later. And, you know, in a perfect world, we sequence them so they're happening at the same time. Because it's just less burden on the public to try to sort through all the complexities of this. So we're looking a few months out.
And the initial determination by a physical services and then the legislature that the DEIS is complete and ready for public review, as Mary Beth so noted, it's a very, very low bar, right? It's not like at the end of the process where you're accepting the final environmental impact statement, et cetera, as to what you've done and what are the mitigations. It's simply saying that there's enough information here that the public should now be brought into this process. So it's a very low bar. You're not making any decision other than this isn't a piece of garbage and shouldn't not be sent out to the public because there's nothing for them to review. So clearly it's going to be passing that very low threshold. So this is more just a matter of formality of going through the steps in seeker. But because Mary Beth and staff has done a lot of work in this, and it clearly far surpasses that very low threshold of simply adequate for public review. So the decision-making on behalf of the legislature is going to be a relatively easy decision, given that low threshold.
If I can, we talked about allowing for public comment. Do we actually hold a public hearing, or we just say this is the comment period for 30 or 60 days?
Legally, you are able to simply say, here's 30 days, go ahead and submit your comments. However, every DIS that I know of any significance, the body that's shepherding the lead agency process wants to have an actual public hearing where people can show up and register their complaints or comments that will be taken into account. So in this case, because it's a very significant actions that we're talking about here, I certainly would recommend to the legislature, it's up to you and your council, but our recommendation from the executive branch would be that you have an actual public hearing set for people to come in. In addition to that, period of time that they can also just submit comments during that
Correct.
open period.
I just wanted that on the record. I wasn't issued.
just to circle back, I was trying to write the numbers down, I wasn't catching up with you, but am I right in understanding that sort of the DEC process, maybe April, kind of thing, March, April, they might be done if I got 30 days in other days, and maybe most of those stuff, and then when would it go to physical service?
It does assume that the variance is issued
Okay,
with a reasonable limit, with reasonable limits.
Okay.
If they do not issue it, then you'd have to go to the next step, whatever that legal next step would
okay,
be,
sure.
or accept the fact that the variance is not issued. Yeah.
I mean, I'm just trying to,
Assuming
when
that
the
it
physical
does.
services get, because if I got it right, the physical service will recommend it to the legislature, then will approve it, and go to public hearing.
Right, so that's the environmental impact statement, right? The variance, my understanding is, right, the variance is a function of you're already a permittee, you're doing what permittees do, there's no separate action legislature associated with that. So it's really, again, it's, this has always been challenging, because we're trying to do three things all at one time. But, assuming that we can get comments back from staff, we have everything that we need, that, staff is satisfied that everything is good to go, then, it's now January, so that's probably realistically March. Because we're probably gonna get all of the documentation, we now have step 2 to you guys, we're gonna get step 3 to you guys, we've gotta get comments back and forth. So that's probably realistically March at the quickest, I would say, depending on what the capacity of everyone is to review everything. And get on things, so then and these things, the variance, as far as I know, and really you guys should chime in on this, can go to DEC as soon as you believe it is ready to go to DEC, and I would suggest sooner rather than later. I wouldn't wait on things, just
Correct.
because their process is a long process. So I would think and then DEC, hopefully we could submit it to them, and then they've been very good about meeting with us, and maybe that's something that we would suggest, is after they've received it and they've had a little time to review it, before they put pen to paper, that we can conduct a meeting with them. Maybe if they have some questions, we may be able to clarify them without getting a letter writing campaign where they're writing us a letter and we're writing them a letter back, which would be ideal, because that will speed the process. But it's still, Legislator Amer, we're still a number of months out, just because there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of different parties that are involved.
Right, Beth, when we get out a few months to when this is, they're completed, then what's the next, main step?
So after we have gotten to a point where the variance, if we kind of play this out, right? So the variance is submitted to DEC at some point in the next several months. There's a draft environmental impact statement that, as Attorney Golden has said, has been before the legislature and meets that relatively low bar of it meets the scoping document and can be out for public comment. So public comment occurs, the public hearing usually is embedded within the comment period. Somewhere along the way, public comment is closed. From a seeker perspective, all of the substantive public comments that come in, we compile them all. And then, remember we mentioned this is a draft environmental impact statement. So a final environmental impact statement is the draft environmental impact statement plus all of the comments that were issued and responses to those comments. That document becomes the final environmental impact statement. So to some degree, the timing of that is dependent on the nature and type of comments that are received. Some comments we would get on environmental impact statements are, I like it, okay, recognized. Some are, I don't like it, okay, recognized, but it's difficult to do something technical with respect to that. So it will depend on the nature of the comments in terms of what needs to be done to provide a proper response. Once that response has been compiled, that process will go over again. It's going to staff will review it, get back to us. We finalize it. It comes, I believe, before this committee, who will then recommend it to physical services, who will then be sending it to the legislature to adopt as a final environmental impact statement. Now that might sound like it ends the process, but seeker's a little confusing. There's actually another step that you have to do. So that FEIS under seeker has to be noticed to the involved and interested agencies and to the public. It'll get published on the website. And then there's a minimum, and it never happens any quicker than this, a minimum of 10 days, is what the law statute says. That FEIS has to kind of be out in the world. And then the very, very, very final step in the process, and this is where the decision-making does really get to be significant, is the issuance of something called a findings statement. And so the findings statement summarizes the process that was undertaken, describes the project, runs through when did we adopt lead agency, all of the steps. But then importantly, what it does is it characterizes any significant potential environmental impacts that were identified and then describes the mitigation measures that are going to be conducted going forward to the extent that the project is funded and built that have to be implemented. And that is the point where, and we've talked about this for a while, seeker has to be conducted. You do have to have a range of options that you have to look at. They require alternatives. And I think we have 9 alternatives. We have a lot of choices. But in the finding statement, for it to be valid for the purposes of moving forward and permitting things and those kinds of things, that's where the decision has to be made about what is the nature of this project. What, how big, what technology,
And
those
what
kinds of
mitigation
things
measures are actually going to be taken.
are going to be taken.
As a result of that. And just one other comment, when I'm sure you already know this, but when you're dealing with constituents, for instance, and people saying, well, when can I comment on it? Really, the most effective time that they can comment is on the draft environmental impact statement. Although it sounds like, well, this is just a draft and we'll get to a final, and the final sounds more important, it's really not. The more important document is really the draft environmental impact statement. That's where their voice will be most heard, is in the comments to the draft. The final simply, it's a little bit of an overstatement, but really just incorporates those statements, answers those. And although there's a possibility that because of those comments, there could be some other significant study that has to be done, that would be done in the FEIS. Normally there isn't. And so the FEIS is more like a cleanup document than anything else. And the real inflection point for public comment would be on the draft environmental impact statement, even though it doesn't sound like it's as important.
That's nice. Yes.
Then as we move on from then, I guess, when would we start actually looking for money, federal money, state money?
So at the conclusion of seeker, which will be the issuance of findings. And I know Attorney Mahoney's been over this a couple of times with this group. There's a proceeding that you have to do under the county law regarding, you're going to make an investment in your system. So you have to do a proceeding under, when is it?
County Article 5.
5A. So there's a proceeding that has to be done, and that's also precedes some of the grants and financing that you would like to try to obtain require that you've been through that Article 5A process before you go start asking for money. The 5A process can't be conducted until seeker is done because actions under 5A are covered by seeker, because seeker says if you're going to fund, undertake, or approve something. So that's kind of if we put our train cars on the tracks, finish seeker, do the 5A process, and apply for financing grants.
Any other questions? Chairwoman?
Sorry about that. A while back, probably over a year ago, we talked about, first of all, the variance that we're talking about today. And then a few months, maybe 6 or 7 months later, you mentioned, well, we may have to go for another variance.
Yeah, we will.
Now, you also mentioned today that if upon looking at this and approving it, they may just extend or give us a whole new permit for 5 years. If that route becomes possible, or the route they choose to take, do we still have to do another variance?
That's an excellent question. Yes, and here's why.
I try.
I know, right? And I know this has been kind of confusing from the beginning. So the activity of collecting the wastewater from all the homes and businesses, putting it in pipes, bringing it to a treatment plant, treating it, and then discharging the clean water to the environment is a regulated activity under New York State law. It's also regulated under the federal law, right? So in order to get a variance, you have to be conducting a regulated activity. So right now, the regulated activity that we're conducting is collecting and treating 6 million gallons of water. So the variance application that we are submitting is to obtain a variance from achieving the total dissolved solid and chloride standards that were put in our species permit in 2020, for which we have a long ramp to comply, for a 6 million gallon a day plant. So that is what we're asking for, because we are currently conducting an activity from which we want a variance. We want to be given a get out of jail free card to not have to meet these standards. We go to do the improvement project, the expansion project, we are now asking to treat some other amount of water. 9, pick a number, some other amount of water. That is also a regulated activity, which will require a species permit. So while in this case, what we did was we got a permit in March of 2020, and in about March or April of 2021, we applied for a variance, and that's the process we're tooling through right now. When we apply for that, whatever decision is made by the legislature with respect to what to do with the Harriman wastewater treatment plant, if it is going to either change the unit processes that we have, so right now we have many, if it's going to change those to some other new unit process, which it may very well, or if it's going to increase the flow, there's a section of state regulations in Part 750 of the state rules and regulations that says when you want to do those kinds of activities, you have to apply for a new permit. So we're going to have to apply for a new permit, but when we apply for that new permit for the larger plant with the new technology, at exactly the same time, we're going to also apply for a variance. So in the case of what we've been working with, we got a permit, we applied for a variance, and they're kind of tracking along this way. When we get to that point where the county has determined what project is being conducted, we'll submit a permit application that at the same time on a parallel track will incorporate the variance application at the same
And
time.
should that shorten the length of time
Yes.
as compared to what we're going through?
Because the other thing I think that we will not have to do is this. Because we already did it. And what we proved in doing that was that the condition that we have is not that out there, you heard me use the word earlier, non-point source, right? That the contamination, right? If you think about it, what's the solution when you have a contaminated thing? Go find out where the contamination is coming from and stop it before it even gets to you. That's the ideal. Our challenge here is that to the extent that we're going to say that we have this constituent that is of concern, chloride, which is a component of total dissolved solids, it is ubiquitous. We've documented that it is ubiquitous. We've documented that treating at the end of a pipe is not going to contribute to eliminating it from the environment because it's there. All right. So in applying for that future variance, since that's an environmental condition that is not going to be changed by anything that any of us do, that there would be no purpose in saying, go sample all these again. You might get a slightly different milligrams per liter of TDS over here, a slightly different milligrams per liter of chloride over there, but not magically overnight are you going to somehow show that yesterday you were well above the 500 for total dissolved solid, and 2 years from now you're magically below. That was the whole purpose of this, is to show that that's not the case.
And we also wouldn't have to do any additional seeker.
Correct.
Seeker covers all of that.
Seekers, this is now done.
Thank you.
Listening part, in this document, I guess it was just the FEIS piece, not the building. Are we talking about 9 million gallons there? And I guess that's the first question. Second part of the question is, when do we officially ask DEC to give us a 9 million? How does that?
Right.
Okay.
Right, so in the facility plan, which is gonna feed the environmental impact statement, right, because we're really very similar documents. We evaluated, I think, 9 alternatives. We're required to evaluate the do nothing alternative, which is just let it sit, which we can't do because we need to meet regulatory standards and we've got aging infrastructure and a bunch of other things. We evaluated, I believe, Anthony, 5 different technology solutions to upgrading the plant to meet the current FEED's permit. Because there's more than just total dissolved solids and chloride in that permit that we need to meet.
It's 36.
So I think we got that. We then evaluated regionalizing the system. So we evaluated 2 ways to consider regionalizing the system. One is a treatment plant over on the Hudson, which remember we had a lot of discussion about that. We evaluated a treatment plant outside of the Ramapo River Basin, but not on the Hudson. So Moon, No Wallkill, pick another water body that doesn't go to the Ramapo River Basin. And I think our last alternative is, and then so for all of those technology alternatives, we evaluate expanding the plant from 6 MGD to 9 MGD. We then have one final alternative, which I know we ran through when I had all those big boards and when Brock came with me, was how big can you make this thing, right? So, and in what increments would you get there? So that's kind of our last, I believe, right, Anthony, I got them all. That's our last alternative that's out there. So the environmental impact statement that we're putting together, the draft environmental impact statement, is making a recommendation to expand the treatment plant to 9 MGD using sequencing back to reactor technology. We worked with staff on preferred technologies and those kinds of things. So, and that has not changed. That has been the case for, at this point, I think years, right? So that has not changed. That does not mean that when the draft EIS comes to you all, you don't say, well, what should we do something different? Should we pick one of these other alternatives, a different technology, or maybe a different volume of water to be treated? Whatever goes out to the public as the environmental impact statement, and Rick, you should jump in here, should have the preferred alternative in it that you want considered by the public, that you as a legislature are considering advancing.
Right. Doesn't mean that you're tied to that preferred alternative, but you are putting forth that this is what we intend to do. You studied the other alternatives, so if it would change later that you would say, no, I don't want our previously preferred, or we have a different preferred, you don't have to redo the whole process over again, because you've still studied all these alternatives. That's one of the reasons why you do that, so that you can change course if you need to. But you should be putting forth your preferred alternative in the DEIS.
And then that preferred alternative is the preferred alternative that ends up in the finding statement. This is a coordinated review, meaning that the DEC receives all the documents, they review them, they provide comments to us, they have done that all along. So they're going to kind of get a heads up when they get the draft environmental impact statement as to what direction we're heading. Not that they aren't already aware of that. Certainly when they receive the FEIS and when they receive the findings, they will receive that. You can, essentially, as soon as you have findings issued, you can apply for, you will have, because you have this facility plan at hand, that's the purpose of the facility plan, is the document that goes together with an application for permit. So you can essentially pull the trigger on that application for permit and a secret's done.
I know the question is asking, what days, month, is it easier to look at quarters? And say, I think we're gonna get here with the second quarter, the third quarter, just to get an idea of how we're moving this along. Nothing's in stone.
It's a number of months. It's probably, to get through the EIS process, it's probably 4 to 6 months from now. I would say all the way to the very end is realistic. It's realistic.
Summertime.
Yeah, it's realistic. It's, as you can see, it's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of documentation.
All right, I'm just trying to understand it. Trying to change it, just trying to understand.
Very best, one more question with regard to you're saying, telling DEC you want to go to 9 million gallons. And we're gonna use the sequential batching.
Mhm.
So that would take, let's say, plan 1, from 2 million gallons up to 7 million gallons. And then or is there a limit as high how many gallons we can treat a day if we can, because it's really would be 11 million gallons.
So the treatment plant, it's, and I know we've gone over this a couple of different times, it's complicated, right? So, when we think about this treatment plant, we don't think about this treatment plant being limited in terms of its capacity to treat the things that are in the water, the constituents in the water, other than total solids and chlorides. We've been over the conventional treatment technologies, don't touch those. We're asking for variance. We think about this treatment plant in terms of its hydraulic capacity, like how much water gets delivered to the treatment plant at any given time. So, when we think about the capacity of the treatment plant, we always talk in terms of average days, like that 6 MGD is the average day. But when it rains a lot, you're gonna see a lot more water than that for some short period of time, and then it's gonna go down. So, the design for these plants has to accommodate those peak hydraulic flows, when there's a lot of flow. But then it also has to work every single day, all the time, 365 days a year at its average flow. So that's what the alternatives look at. We have a variety of alternatives that technologically work at treating 6 MGD, or treating 9 MGD on average. They will actually treat, I don't remember what the peaking factor here is, it's probably 17, 18, 19 million gallons will come in on a heavy rain day. It's a lot, right? So if we go to an even bigger facility, say 12 million, or I think we programmed out that in the way future, you could get probably approach 20 million gallons of treatment on this site. One of the things that I know we talked about this when we were here late in the summer, is we have to make sure that when we redesign the facility, knowing that that may be our outside, that we plan the front door, the headworks where the water comes in, to be big enough so it can accommodate that whole wide range of flows. So that's what we've done here. In addition to that, we did talk about the need to increase the size of the interceptor sewers to deliver the water to the wastewater treatment plant. So right now, I believe we have a variety of options to go to 9 MGD. We have an option that shows going from using SPR technology from 9 to 12. And then eventually, if you were to go do something different with train 3, you could go upwards of 19 million and change. But that would be, if you think about, you've been out on the site, you have train 3, which is the newest one, kind of closer to Mary Harriman Park. Right now, that's going to sit there and continue to do what it does because it's relatively new and it works extremely well. It works extremely well. This would be, what could you do in the footprint of train 1, train 2? Does that answer your questions?
Any other questions or comments? Anybody out in the audience?
Yeah, I'm just trying to clarify the last paragraph on the first page. It says the source of chloride and the influent to Harriman WWTP appears to be an urban non-point source. Removal will not result in improvement to surface ground. What does non-point source mean?
That's a great question. So a point source is where we can go out in the world and literally say, this pipe right here, the water in this pipe is causing the problem. But what we're really seeing and what we said is that the total dissolved solids and the chlorides that we have are coming from 2 sources. One is just groundwater. Our geology, the water is super hard. So that's where chlorides come. Chloride is naturally occurring in this geology. So it's not a point source. I can't go point at something. It's literally just the groundwater writ large has chloride and high total dissolved solids in it. In addition to that, when we say urbanization, what we really mean is just, we have a lot of, we have a lot of houses, we have a lot of roads, we have a lot of businesses. And in just simply everyday life, using laundry soap, using shampoo, water treatment softeners, water softeners in people's houses to soften their water, all of those things, chlorine itself, chlorine that we all rely on so we don't get sick, right, has chloride in it. So again, we can't go point any one place and say, this is the one and only source of this problem. If we eliminated this, the universe would be good. What we can say is there are a lot of contributors. There isn't any one. There are many that have gotten it to this point. That's what the sampling shows.
So none of the upstream, like the poultry plant, that has nothing to do with it?
It has something to do with it. You can see that those values are very, very
Yeah.
high. But what we can also see is that even if we go look, and we did wells way beyond that, chloride's really high in those too. So that's that, yes, everybody's adding their own little chunk, but it's a lot of little chunks that are adding up. There isn't, again, we can't go say, if only we got rid of the poultry plant, the problem would go away. The sampling shows the poultry plant is a part of the problem, but it's not the only.
No, and I'm not disagreeing with that, but you'd have to think if the poultry plant was not there,
It's part of, it's
it-
Or at least-
that those levels wouldn't be where they are.
at a minimum, controlling that 6,600 milligrams of total dissolved solids would make a difference. But the drinking water is really, really high, and the drinking water, and we think about the poultry plant as kind of a percent of the total contributions, it's a little piece, it's not most. So, isn't it like 85% of the land use in the Harriman wastewater service area? Fully 85% is residential, it's just people in their houses.
So when you say really, really high, what does really, really high mean?
In terms of, so when you look at that map, you see that poultry plant, the total dissolved solids, at the day that was sampled, these were samples done at one point in time. This was the poultry plant's wastewater going to the wastewater treatment plant was at 6,600 milligrams per liter of total dissolved solids, and then the fraction of that was chloride was 3,800 milligrams per liter. The regulatory standard is 500 for total dissolved solids and 250 for chloride. So it's really high, right? But then when we come down and say we look down at, some of these other numbers, they're still really high too. And they're not necessarily all, directly associated with that. There's other mapping in this document, and I can send it, that where we show all of the drinking water sources that we sampled. And many of them are above the regulatory standard. They're not 6,600, but they might be 600 or 700 or 800, which again is indicating to us that there's a lot of sources of this problem. And that's the point we're trying to make in terms of the variance. Now, anything that we can do to reduce the amount of chloride in the environment is a good thing. So to the extent that the poultry plant could reduce those loadings, that would be a good thing. To the extent, and one of the recommendations, would be, the county owns county roads. It's not a lot of roads, you look at overall amount of roads in the region. But to the extent that the county owns roads and controls those roads, let's look at, salting practices. And are there better practices that could be used so that we're not, again, it's this little tiny slices of things. When you look at the road, and that's also in this document, which we can send people the document without all the attachments, so it's a lot shorter. But by percentage, most of the roads that are being salted are owned by either local governments or state federal government. So local governments, that's a recommendation. Look at your salting practices. Those kinds of things. There's some guidance documents that I think are included as attachments here for those kinds of things. But what are the sources of chloride? When we say urbanization, that includes things like we have a lot of lane miles of road that are being salted. Urbanization equals roads. Urbanization just also equals a lot of population. One of the things that DEC asked us to do was identify if there were any industrial sources of chloride that were obvious. So one of them would be the poultry plant. That's a pretty obvious one. But once we get past the poultry plant and we look at the industrial dischargers in the wastewater treatment plant service area, there aren't very many, and there isn't a big indication that any of them are contributing significant amounts of chloride. So it's one of these, when you're looking at trying to control where it's coming from, this is a process of 1,000 cuts. One of the things that would definitely be recommended is that, the poultry plant look to reduce the amount of chloride and total dissolved solid that it's entering into the systems. Because as we've talked about many times, it passes right through the existing conventional treatment plants and right into the water. But so does all the road, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but yesterday we had ice all over the place upstate. And people, I mean, I went out and there was layers of salt on roads this thick. You know, that is not good for the environment. So there's a lot of different things. But again, the math and the science shows that while we can eliminate some of these contributors, overall, it's a combination of the geology, which was put here a long time ago, and we're not going to change that, and the urbanization of the area. And again, not a problem for just here, but really we see it all over the Northeast and really all over the country.
So does the flow from the poultry plant come down through those tributaries that connects into the S5 location?
Yeah, so the flow from the poultry plant is going to the Curie-Stoll wastewater treatment plant, where, as we mentioned, TDS and chloride, there's no mechanism to remove those there, just like there's no mechanism at Harriman.
Right.
So it kind of goes in one side and comes out the other, and you can see the wastewater treatment plant effluent is that next box, it's 2,800 and 1,200, so there's some reduction. So some of that TDS and chloride is, you know, either it's bound to things that are being pulled out organically,
It's being diluted. It's
diluted,
being diluted.
right, with other flow, because the poultry plant doesn't discharge by volume as much water as the rest of the contributors to that treatment plant. But then, yeah, the effluent that discharges from the KJ wastewater treatment plant goes to a wetland, I believe, which eventually feeds the stream, which eventually ends up in the Ramapo, which eventually ends up down at the Harriman wastewater treatment plant. So it's going fast. It's not in the treatment plant effluent. It's not a pipe. But when we look at RR down 0001, that's at the outfall. That 610 and 240 is a representation of the dilution that's happened coming downstream quarter. This is one of the things, and we talked about this before, and I don't know if you were here for this discussion, Tony, but the Ramapo River Basin is a highly constrained river basin. It's very shallow watershed, so it's a very small watershed, doesn't have a lot of area to gather a lot of water. All of the groundwater sources in the area are very shallow, meaning like a well might be 40 feet deep to get into what are called alluvial deposits, so those are left over from the glaciers. And so anything that's on the surface ends up down in the groundwater pretty quickly. It's just the geology of this area, and the water is just naturally really, really hard.
Okay, Don, you have a question?
Just want to comment on the poultry processing plant, as I have said before. Curie-Stoll is still pursuing disconnecting the poultry processing plant from the Curie-Stoll plant and building a separate, whether it's going to be a reverse osmosis or another type of filtration to treat chloride coming out from the poultry processing plant. That is still in the works. I've notified the county before. I know the county has communicated with some of the professionals that we have hired on that issue, which is CBM Smith, Merge, and others. So that's a general comment. On the issue of the variance, I have two questions. First, the DEC, if they issue a variance, is that forever? Is that for 5 years, 2 years? Second question, what if they deny issuing variance?
So the variances are issued, they are embedded in the Speedies permit. And as you know, the Speedies permits are 5-year permits. So every 5 years, or usually it's about every 3.5 years, as I think you know from the Village Wastewater Treatment Plant, you'll receive a nice letter from the DEC asking for information so that they can renew your permit. Just like all other constituents in a wastewater treatment plant's permit, generally speaking, they either don't change, new ones show up only as a result of regulatory action, or if there's some other change in the environment where the department says, okay, we need to modify either your limit for something to be more protective of the water, those kinds of things. Generally speaking, everything that's in your permit stays in your permit from, every 5 years, you just get a new permit with the same stuff in it. This variance will probably not be much different from that, because this documentation is really important, and the discussion we just had is showing that the condition that is out there, where we have this high total dissolved solid and chloride, will not change substantially. The groundwater is going to continue. If we sample the groundwater 10 years from now, it's probably going to have just as much chloride or total dissolved solid in it as it does today, because a lot of it, the contribution is from groundwater. It's just from the geology. So the expectation would be that while the variance goes with the permit and it's a 5-year, it's going to be issued embedded in the permit, just like all of your other permit criteria, you get a new permit, it's going to be in that permit, just very much like mercury. Your mercury variance carries through every permit that you get. It's the same, the current standard for mercury is 0.07 and you're at 50. And that's because there's a statewide variance for mercury. And you don't have to apply separately, and there's nothing magical that happens out there, and you don't go do more sampling to justify it. It is the ambient condition that the state has determined is the case, and that's why there's a mercury minimization program in your permit. All variances have to have minimization programs. Counties work very hard on coming up with a minimization program that would likely be embedded in this permit. So while it rides with the permit, there is no reason to believe that unless the underlying condition somehow changes, that it would change.
You said a magic word. Mercury variance is statewide.
Correct.
This isn't going to be a statewide. The state may say, we understand that there is a remedy to your problem, which is reverse osmosis. We're going to give you a variance for 10 years, but within 10 years, you should have your reverse osmosis built.
So again, if that was to be the case, and there's a reason that we looked for this variance under not just one, which would be the right? We looked at it under human caused, geology and ubiquitous, and inappropriate social and economic impact. That's why we're using 3 prongs of this test. If we were simply relying on, say, geology, then I could see your argument. The state could come back and say, yeah, well, you didn't argue that it was an undue economic burden. We are arguing all 3 of these, and we intend to get the variance under all 3 of these, such that 10 years from now, I would venture to guess that if the cost of reverse osmosis, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but was excessively expensive, it certainly is not going to be any less expensive in Michigan. And as far as I'm aware, ion exchange through reverse osmosis is the only way to reduce total dissolved solids and chloride. All of the brains in the world have not come up with another solution short of, well, you could evaporate it, put it in a giant ocean and let wind and sun and air evaporate it. You end up with all of the nice chloride sitting in a little pile at the bottom that takes decades.
Salt flats.
Right, exactly. So it's unlikely that would be the case, simply because that's why we're asking for the variance under those 3 prongs.
So let me just one follow up, if I may. Since the design for the new additions in your facilities plan has options of going to Ramapo and it has options of going to others.
Mhm.
Isn't that something that the DEC is going to be picking up and saying, why continue with the variance and dump it into the Ramapo? Why not go to another stream that doesn't require a variance?
It's a great question. So one of the challenges, we were just talking about how the Ramapo River Basin is a very shallow river basin. It does not have a lot of contributors. There are some tributaries, but they're relatively small. If you're familiar with the Ramapo down in Rockland County, if you go down Tuxedo, it's channeled. Because when they built the thruway, they literally took the stream and they relocated it and they built sides like you see in California. That's what the Ramapo looks like there. It's not very good for the environment, but that's what they have. You get down to Suffern, and the Ramapo is a very much larger body of water. There's a lot more contributions to it. The challenge that DEC would have in saying, well, take your ball and go home, right? So take your 6 million gallons or 9 million gallons of water and go to the Moona or go to the Hudson, is that if that were to be the case, it would have an enormous negative impact on 2 things: fisheries and aquatic life, as well as Rockland County, their drinking water supply. Because the flow of the Harriman wastewater treatment plant in the upper reaches of the Rampo is the base flow of the stream. So it's a push me, pull you. Yes, you might be addressing this chloride and TDS issue, but you would now also have effectively killed the stream by taking the water away. So it's a complex scenario. One of the other things that is worth noting, and this again is described in detail in the documentation, is that the standards for total dissolved solid and chloride are aesthetic. They are not directly related to human health. The standard for chloride and total dissolved solid has to do with taste. And there was when these regulations were promulgated, there was an idea that at around 250 milligrams per liter of chloride, if it's in conjunction with sodium, most people, the average person, can taste it. And there was a concern that if you exceeded that, people would not drink as much water. And that would then result in human health impacts because you would have a population of people walking around chronically dehydrated, right? Some of us are old enough to remember that was like the medical ill of a period of time where it was like, oh, you're just dehydrated, drink more water. There's a few things that have changed. One is that I think in the medical field, and you can certainly verify this, I'm not a medical person, but that this concept of chronic dehydration has been downplayed in recent decades. It's not considered to be as important as it once was. And the second thing is the advent of bottled water. And certainly a lot of people drink bottled water, whether it's they're buying water at Stewart's or they're simply having bottled water imported into their homes that they're using as their drinking water source. It's significantly reduced this sort of background concern that increasing levels of total dissolved solids and chloride might impact people's, it's an aesthetic concern, it might impact their health. Another thing, and this is one that makes us all laugh, at above 500 milligrams per liter of total dissolved solids, depending on your personal health, you may have a laxative effect from drinking water that has very high total dissolved solids in it. So there's another concern, health concern, seems to be less deeply connected as it was once thought to be. So again, as we look at, to your point about, these are always balancing, right? Any time that DC is issuing a permit, and particularly when they're looking at a variance, they're balancing one concern against another. Concern of environmental versus public health versus the practical realities that we have, we are a highly urbanized area here in the northeastern United States. And as I said, this is not a unique problem here. This is a problem that's seen broadly in highly urbanized areas.
Just one comment, the EFC deadline for new applications is every year in June.
Mm-hmm.
I know you're working towards finishing this process. Meeting the June deadline for applications would be very helpful, very significant.
Yes, so there's a June 16th deadline. We can certainly, depending on where the county is, the facility plan is more than enough of a documentation to list the project for financing. The actual application for financing to state that you want their money, that requires the Article 5A process to be conducted.
Which may require a little bit of time. Generally, in their Article 5A, you need to make an application to the comptroller for the funds.
And that takes time.
That takes, obviously, acts of legislature, which you can go through. More importantly, it requires a specific number, figure. Usually you're gonna do that after permitting, after design.
Yeah, at least after preliminary design, so that you have.
So you have a more accurate figure.
That'll never.
No, not this June.
But doesn't need to.
We can for to list, so the EFC process has multiple pieces. One thing we can do is we can list a project without having done that, because we're not making any commitments. All we're saying is, we might do a project, we may be interested in your money, we'd like to know how competitive we are for your money. Because it's a competitive process, you get ranked and scored among with all of your friends and neighbors for projects of your size. So that process we may very well be able to, because that just simply requires an engineering report. That process, and you're not making any commitments, you're just saying, tell me how competitive I am. So that process we may very well be able to do by June. the actual application for financing, to Joe's point, it takes more time because there's more parts involved.
Okay, I'm gonna take one more question because we have to get ready to wrap this up, Katie.
Just a follow-up to the other question, what are the chances the DEC denying granting the variance? And is there a plan B if they don't?
So, when you look at the situation, right, the requirement to meet total dissolved solids and chloride is what's called a water quality standard, so it's out there in the world. We are applying for a variance from that because we think we need the criteria to achieve that. We've had many discussions with department staff, DEC staff over time, and every indication that we have, and without getting ahead of them, is that they understand the situation that we're in, and they indicate that as provided we provide the justification that variance may be issued. There's no guarantees, right? So the alternative is, and this is embedded in the speedies permit, is that, that's the other alternative we have. The other alternative that's in the facility plan is to build a reverse osmosis system. So it's actually already in there. So that would be the other alternative, although I would think that it would be highly unlikely that that would come to pass.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mary Beth. I'm gonna move on. I think, item B on the sampling process, I think we kind of got through with this. And then Bob with the sewer meter, update. I think you have some updates on that.
Sure, that's been uploaded. It's out for bid.
Please have to.
Our dates are, questions are due February 1st from potential bidders, and a bid opening on February 15th.
Okay, great. And next up on item D, the Village of South Blooming Grove, just wanted to see how things were going with that, with our new project.
Yes, so we approved the new project together with the budget for 2023. We're finalizing engineering. Alfosco, village engineers working on that. The financing is allocated. Hopefully we can start a project soon. He's in touch with the new as well, and we should be up and running. So
Wait, did they, so did you put the order in with them? Because I know they said there would be a time lag
We're
too.
waiting for bond council, because we're gonna have to finance a bond,
Okay,
so we're waiting.
and there's some engineering components, some loose ends between Mr. Fosco and it's being fine-tuned.
okay, and then also I think that they're gonna credit back, Bob, the
Pilot?
Yeah, the pilot,
Yeah.
pilot, yeah, so.
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question. Did you elect to purchase the system
Yeah.
or a lease?
Purchase.
Purchase.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks.
Next up, what we're gonna do is, looks like we're gonna try to change our day for the remainder of the year. And instead of the third Wednesday of the month, we're gonna go to the third Tuesday of the month, so it's just a day earlier. But that would be at what time did you say? 2:00. So that makes the next meeting would be
The 14th.
Working, right.
It's Valentine's.
Valentine's. Well, no,
Well, that doesn't.
No, no, to the 21st.
Tuesday, the 21st.
it's the 21st.
Okay, I was gonna say, any dates for Valentine's, that doesn't have to be.
So we have last meeting.
Oh, okay, great.
The 21st.
Yeah, the 21st at 2 p.m. And then it'll be the, and then,
It'll be in New York.
Next one.
Yeah.
oh, is that,
Third.
Association of Towns annual meeting.
Association, that's the day after. The 21st.
yeah. All right, so for February, should we just make it the 28th?
What,
Oh, are you?
why can't you do the 21st?
Why can't it be the 21st?
Most people.
We can, it's just that I think,
Well, I mean,
because
we've got
it's
two
a-
meetings after this. We've got
oh, yeah,
human services and health and mental health that are gonna occur after, right?
yeah, yeah.
Okay, you leave it on the 15th. For that month.
Because that is not, I mean, that would be a special meeting.
Yeah,
Everybody agrees to come in that day. But you're not gonna be, we're trying to combine it. To-
Okay.
capture as many members
Yep, I got you.
as possible, and for the most part, that Tuesday is the day that most of the legislators.
Pretty much everybody's. here.
Okay, so we'll leave it on the
21st.
21st. And we'll leave it on the 21st, and then, we get past that one, maybe down to the city. Bob?
Anthony will be.
Okay. All right, so the next meeting will be Tuesday, February 21st at 2 PM up here in the statutory committee room. And with that, is there any other items?
Unfortunately, for a future meeting, Mr. Chairman, the guy who sent us something that kind of got me interested. I did hear from somebody else who's in another project. And the governor stated this, she issued this desire to create a housing project, something called the New York Housing Compact for 2024. And I looked at some of it, and, some of it seems sacrosanct. I mean, to take on home rule is a scary kind of thing. But to be able to say you can, that certain places will be targeted for building certain kind of houses, and you don't go along with it. That might, I don't know if that'll impact it. Look, it's got 2 or 3 months of politicking that will go on before whether it ever sees the light of day. I don't think it's something we get too excited about. We should know about it. And if you have any, or we hear anything about it, we should brief on it, because it seems to me it could affect, the numbers of gallons that people are being asked to say they have. What happens if X number of acres in Durham or something gets taken over as workforce housing, and it adds how many thousand gallons to Durham that they never expected. That's a what if, I don't know, I'm not saying it's real, but it's something we should just be aware of.
What I read was their target was 3% new units every year.
Okay, so I
I
didn't.
think we're far in excess of that in towns that we study.
We are, yeah, we are.
Sorry,
Well,
I don't know
I
much
didn't
about
read it
it.
thoroughly, but it took us 3% increase every year, annual new housing units, okay?
So a couple of really quick on that.
Projections we did
So
exceed.
last year, the governor included in her budget and state, an ADU with additional dwelling units for houses. That went down in flames. She said, look, these two is home issues. This is attempt number 2. And I always just caution people, whatever shows up in her stuff